Hey all, what's up? My name is Zach, and welcome back to Your Type, where we talk about all things Jungian cognitive functions. Today, we're going to be talking about the INFP and the ESTJ personality types. Have you ever dealt with an INFP and been amazed at how airy and all over the place they manage to be? Have you ever dealt with an ESTJ and been frustrated by them being really rigid or inflexible? Well, let's actually break these two types down and see what it means to live like either one of these. Full disclaimer from the get go, I myself am an INFP and I think a lot about this type. So let's just get straight into it. I thought about some of the more common stereotypes of these two different types. And I think with the INFP, one that comes along a lot is this idea of sadness. You have a lot of examples of INFPs throughout history and throughout media and literature that are pretty sad people. Why is this? Why are we sad? What's going on there? Well, I think that there is a strong component of our primary function here, introverted feeling, coming along and really creating this rich narrative that lives inside our heads. INFPs are introverts. So the first tendency is to go inside, look at the subjective experience. What do I think about this situation? How do I feel about what's going on? Right? We're always collecting data as people, and I don't mean INFPs, but everybody. We're always collecting data from the world. However, how we actually interpret that will differ across different types. That introverted feeling of the INFP leads us to often becoming just completely lost in our own fantasy world in our heads. There's so much to think about with the world. What is the point of life is probably the biggest question we can ask ourselves. And I'm not saying that INFPs have a lock on philosophy, but I think this idea that we are emotional philosophers of some kind is one that is pretty prevalent amongst this community of INFPs. Really, just this idea that I'm just feeling all the time is one that really resonates with a lot of us. I have friends that are also INFPs that just can't get out of their heads either. Now, I think part of what's driving that is our secondary extroverted intuition. NE as a function lets people go out and create new things and new opportunities. Now, as the secondary function of the INFP, extroverted intuition is serving or working for your primary function, your introverted feeling. So let's think about this. If an introverted feeler is experiencing something, they've made some sort of value judgment, well, what's going to come in next? The extroverted intuition, that NE, goes out into the world and tries to create new possibilities specifically that match within that value state. Now, a lot of INFPs are deeply creative people because of this. We're always going out and trying to find and create things that match what we're feeling. This manifests itself in things like writing poetry or music. As we go down our function stack, we have introverted sensing as our third function and extroverted thinking as our fourth. These two functions are really good at getting things done, and we'll talk about them more in detail when we get to the ESTJs in just a minute. But introverted sensing as a function really allows the INFP to create organized structures within their mind. For me, I think of it like a mental library, flipping through things and thinking, what does this situation need right now? Let me go through the catalogs and just, I have this mental image of going into my mind and literally flipping through volumes of information. That's introverted sensing, but it's not quite as developed. This is my third function out of four. So it takes time for that to get better. I find that as an INFP, the more that I can intentionally organize things in my world around me, like write notes and create schedules, the more that I create that sort of organization in the world, I have a mirror image in my head of that. The more I create stability internally by creating external order. That external order really comes from that extroverted thinking. TE as a function is all about getting things done. How can we be efficient and make decisions quickly based off of data? Now, TE as a function for us as INFPs is one that can be quite draining. We typically don't use it very much. And that's true for anyone in their last function. It's just more energy consuming to actually engage in that because you're using more cognition. You're pulling from deeper places within your mind. It's easy to just do the most natural thing. In our case, as the INFP, it's feel stuff. But being an extroverted thinker requires actual effort for the INFP. Because of this, we get a lot of stereotypes like being chronically late, but we don't really seem to mind at the same time. We start a lot of projects, but don't always necessarily finish them. What's that about? Well, I think this idea that, an INFP might have 10 novels that they've started, 4 albums that they have recorded halfway through, and I don't know, uh, a wall of instruments that they almost never play. You can see the INFP has all these ideas and these dreams and these aspirations, but it's hard to actually create the structure to do those things. Something that I think is quite common across INFPs is that we tend to be quite conflict averse in our peacemaking situations. If there's an argument going around, my goal is to end that argument as quickly as possible. Now, it's not to just put a blanket over it and try and make things go away, but actually try and get people to a middle ground. INFPs tend to be quite centrist in the way they approach arguments. We, as introverted feelers, have our own feelings about things. Introverted feeling is a judging function, meaning we're going to be quick to make a decision. But because we have that secondary NE, we might go out and try and pull what is this argument saying and what is this argument saying, pull them together into the middle, the peaceful INFP. Our approach for resolving conflict is how can we have some sort of heartfelt, deep conversation that actually truly meets someone where they're at emotionally. There's also just this hopeless romanticism around us. I think you can see this in a lot of the poetry and the art that INFPs create, but there's this just love of love that so many of us have that can lead to a lot of issues. Being a hopeless romantic, well, it's in the name, hopeless. If you are creating these idealized fantasies, which again, that FINE combo loves doing, well, you're going to get stuck in fantasy land and not actually be able to produce anything in the world. Let's contrast that now with the ESTJ. Whereas the INFP goes from introverted feeling at the top all the way down to extroverted thinking at the bottom, the ESTJ flips that around to where their primary mode of doing things is that extroverted thinking function. ESTJs and TE users and TE leads especially are quite efficient at getting things done. It doesn't take a lot of searching to find examples of this. Here are just some ESTJs that are just maniacs at getting stuff done. It's part of what makes them who they are. They're just people that want things done right and they want it done quickly. Why so quickly? Well, that thinking function, that extroverted thinking, is pulling data in from the world. Their secondary function, introverted sensing, is more developed than mine and third place. And the way I like to think of it is it's almost like instead of having a mental catalog that they're flipping through volumes, it's like they've upgraded to the Dewey Decimal System and they can look things up. So there's this like quick decision making with a lot of data to back it up. That introverted sensing is letting them pull in all the information from the world, organize it, and then apply it to that decision in order to justify it. Remember, that second function serves the primary function. It's really there to allow that first function to really flourish. Now, ESTJs have a third function of extroverted intuition, or NE. I think it's interesting that this often manifests itself in a lot of creative outlets for ESTJs. For example, an ESTJ like Gordon Ramsay is really good at getting things done exactly how he wants them done. And he's used that tertiary extroverted intuition to create this new thing, this cooking empire that he has that allows him to actually express that and get it out there. That is powerful use of a tertiary function. Obviously he's a little older, he's had time to develop this, and you can see if people really do develop themselves. And I like Gordon Ramsay because he's lived a hard life. He tells stories about abuse during his childhood, and I think that shows the trauma really pushed him to develop and forced him into these really unfortunate situations that probably that bottom FI, that last function for him, led to all of these emotional outbursts that we see on TV even now. His use of all of these functions comes together to create a pretty balanced person. Because you can see clearly his values of things are very strongly held. That's that introverted feeling. So even in last place, he's still using these functions really strongly. He obviously values children and showing them encouragement and helping them become better cooks. You can see how he treats children versus adults. There's a clear difference there. And I think that really is that introverted feeling coming through and really supporting him to create a better environment for those kids that he talks to in his shows. ESTJs often get tagged as just these hard ass drill sergeant, like hyper competitive walking spreadsheets that they're just so organized. And in large part, yeah, that happens a lot. I mean, someone has to do that, right? I think a lot of the conflict between INFPs and ESTJs comes out when we try to understand how all over the place the INFP is and how structured and rigid the ESTJ can be, because they're both necessary for different situations. If you're trying to just creatively free flow create some art, yeah, I think the state of being that the INFP is typically in is probably pretty efficient. But if you want to actually commercialize that art and do something with it and make a living out of it, I think the ESTJ's approach works really well. Now, as two types that have reverse order of functions, I think the dynamic between the two can be quite interesting. For one, the more you develop your third, fourth, even second functions, the more you will start to manifest traits of those other types. Because now all of a sudden they're not quite as underdeveloped. Now, I don't believe you're going to completely flip yourself around and let's say an INFP gets really structured and organized. I'm not going to wake up one day as an ESTJ, nor do I think an ESTJ is just going to let loose and party and go crazy and then suddenly be an INFP. But I think that part of healthy development involves actually pulling in these resources and creating something new out of it. How do we actually develop ourselves and get to a place where those functions that weren't as used become part of our mainstay. I would say that INFPs ultimately need to learn how to live a little less in the clouds and plant their feet a little more firmly on the ground. And I would say the opposite for the ESTJ. Learn to just loosen up a little bit. I tease the ESTJ because I do feel like we're kindred spirits here, flipping our functions around. That's one of the beauties of the Myers-Briggs formula. Each type has a counterpart that you are quite opposite of, but also pretty similar to at the same time.